All right, good evening, everybody. It is 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and kick off our February chapter meeting of the Association of IT Professionals, Gainesville, Florida. I gotta find a way to make that title even longer. I don't have a whole lot of pomp and circumstance for the beginning of the meeting today. We have a great speaker here, Mike Rodrick, who's gonna be talking to us about Windows Remote Desktop, so I'm excited to hear about that. We already have our speaker lined up for next month, which is Mr. Anthony Sequeira. Oh shoot, I told him I was going to mispronounce his name. I try to say his name a different way each time, so have some fun with it. But he's going to be here in March to talk to us about some of the Cisco automation stuff that's going on in the network world. Really cool what's going on there. Huge changes across Cisco's product platform, so we'll learn a lot about that. Otherwise, we would like to welcome 2 new board members. So at our board meeting earlier this month, we had the opportunity to invite Sandy and Rolando to join the board. Both of them graciously accepted that, so thank you both, and I'd like to get around for them. Yep. And for everybody else here, you're always welcome to participate. We are in the process of kind of reformulating how we handle managing our membership and stuff now that the national organization and the local chapters are, separate but united. It's strange. So basically, we get to manage our own membership now. So we are still part of national, but membership is now our responsibility. So we're going to be kind of changing the way, but we are always looking to get new members in. A lot of the dialogue that we have prior to these meetings, we talk about technology and stuff. That's a lot of fun, and it's always cool to hear the things that other people are doing. So if you have a friend, somebody who'd like to attend, be sure to share that with them. Also, we are not streaming live for this one, but it is being recorded, so the session will be posted on YouTube like all of our sessions are, so people can catch the presentation afterwards if you have to miss it. All right, well, I think that is all I have for our welcome, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you, Mike, and what are you going to tell us about?
We are going to be talking all about Windows Virtual Desktop. Thanks, Don. So how many of you out there, have you heard of Windows Virtual Desktop? You guys thought about using it in your organizations, or any maybes? No, not yet. All right, well, hopefully I can change your mind. We're going to take a look at what Windows Virtual Desktop is all about and how we can get it set up. If you have questions, obviously just ask as we go. Basically what I've done, when you set up Windows Virtual Desktop, one of the components includes a virtual machine that's going to be hosted up in Azure, and that's what people are actually connecting to, and Azure will spin up multiple instances of this virtual machine based on your needs and what you've set up as far as performance requirements and pooled versus single user machines and things like that. But the spinning up of that initial virtual machine can take about 45 minutes or so. So that part I've already done so that I could make sure, one, it was working and we could actually take a look at it and use it. So what I thought we would do, much like I do for our webinar here, is we'll go through all the different steps of getting to that. But when we get to that final stage and get ready to actually go create this VM, we'll just switch over to the pre-baked one that I've got done, and we'll take a look at how that actually functions. So another question for you, has anybody ever implemented anything like remote desktop services, or any kind of virtual desktop infrastructure on premises, or if we go back further, terminal services? Good times? Good times?
The only problem was like when there was problems with keyboard delay when working remotely.
Yeah, that was a big issue. Profiles typically was an issue as well. Like if you connected to a different instance of a VM, did you have all your documents there? How did you set that up? And especially nowadays with all of the online services that we're utilizing, Office 365 and OneDrive, that becomes a big problem, because if you don't have that persistent desktop, how do I get access to all of my information if I'm going to connect to a different virtual machine each time this pops up? And that's what Windows Virtual Desktop does, right? It is basically it's an Azure version of good old terminal services, where we're setting up a virtual desktop infrastructure and giving people access to this desktop. And bear with me, I'm going to log in real quick. This thing has timed out. So you guys, how many of your users use iPads? A few of you? One of you? Okay. One of the cool things about Windows Virtual Desktop is because it is, And I typed in the wrong password. Typing and talking is difficult. .com. Oops. There we go. Give me 1 second. See if I get logged in. One of the great things, one of my favorite features of Windows Virtual Desktop is because it's web-based. Right? You can connect to it from anything. Anything that has a browser that is HTML5 compatible. So whether you're using the new Edge, Chrome, Firefox, as long as it supports HTML5, they can access this through a portal. Or you can take an iPad like this and you can give them access and go ahead. It's a full-blown Windows desktop. So what I've done is logged in with a user that I have given access to Windows Virtual Desktop. And the image I chose should have Office installed, so you can try to launch Excel if you want, or Word. And you'll find that it's actually pretty responsive. And you think about the possibilities of how my end users have their own devices, right? They've got their phones, they've got their iPads, they've got their tablets. I don't need to issue them a laptop. I can just give them their credentials and they can connect to a Windows desktop via the browser or via an app, a remote desktop app. So no more, trying to set up this, maintaining multiple images and doing in-house terminal services, all handled by Azure, available anywhere that they've got internet access for many browsers. And it's actually not terribly difficult to set up. I will say that I've been playing around with this since it first started, right about before they went into general availability. And it was a little quirky at first. There wasn't a lot of documentation for it. But they have made, since they've gone, they went general availability in September. Right about the time of Ignite, they announced they were going to go GA. And initially, they were only going to go to certain regions in Azure. But they ended up releasing it to everybody because the demand was so great and the response was so good. They decided to roll it out to everybody. So it's available from any region in Azure. Some of the regions, and this probably wouldn't affect us, but some of the regions don't have all of the resources in that region, so they would still have to go across the WAN to another data center to pull. So they're saying that you might have a little more latency than you would like. But as this progresses, they're going to make sure that each region has the resources necessary to host the infrastructure. So well, let's see, Brad, if we can pull up my screen here. So I've got Windows Terminal open, and I thought what I would do first, like I said, I wanted to show you that. So that's running on an iPad. If I fire up a browser here on my machine, and I'm going to go to, oops, that is not it. Here. So this is what your end user would be seeing. So they would come, they would open up whatever device they had. On the iPad, I'm actually using the remote desktop app that Microsoft puts out. It's available in the iOS store. It's also available in the Microsoft store. I believe there's one in the Google store as well. It is not the same as the remote desktop client. So just keep that in mind. It's not the old school MSTSC, the terminal services client. This is a new monster here. I'm going to log in. So user browses to this URL. They are using their Azure credentials, or their Active Directory credentials, I should say. Assuming I typed the password correctly. The way they describe it, their terminology, they call these feeds, and you subscribe to feeds, and the feed is what we're publishing from Azure, and we can do it in a couple of different ways. We can publish an entire desktop, like you see on that iPad, where they get Windows, right, and they get any apps that I want to install. Much like back in the day with VDI or with terminal services, we can create that master image and we can install a line of business applications. We can put whatever apps we want on there, or we can use an Azure template, which is what I've done, just a standard Windows 10. Let me take that back. I say standard. One of the other really cool things about Windows Virtual Desktop is this is the only place you can get the Windows 10 Multi-User Edition. You guys are familiar with servers. We've always had where we could have 2 logons, right? 2 admins can log on. But the client has always been very restrictive about that, where you can only have 1 session logged onto that machine. With this new version of Windows 10, it is designed for multi-use. So we can spin up this Windows 10 VM, and we can have 5, 10 people connecting to that same VM, not separate instances, but the same VM. Give it enough resources, give it everything it needs. So it is designed to be multi-user, which is a really cool thing. So this is the portal they would connect to, and I'm going to click on this guy here, and I'll click allow. You can obviously choose not to ask me again. And wait for the authentication as it reaches out. There is at this point 2 authentication prompts that your users run into. They're working on that. They're trying to get SSO set up. The first one is to connect basically to Azure. Right, that first screen you saw with that icon that I clicked on, it has to know who I am in order to provide the appropriate feeds. Like, are you even allowed to connect to Windows Virtual Desktop? Which desktop do you get? Because we can host multiple desktops with different applications, one for our marketing people, one for our engineers that have different software and things like that. So the first authentication was just to connect to Azure and figure out who you are and what I'm supposed to show you. The second authentication was actually connecting to the Windows 10 VM that was spun up. Now, eventually, as Microsoft says, that'll be SSO. Also, another limitation at this point is they don't support, of all things, they don't support Azure Active Directory for their authentication. You have to be running either on-premises Active Directory and be in a hybrid situation, or you have to run Azure Active Directory Domain Services out there in Azure. But the standard Azure AD, which is just their identity store, right, that is not supported yet, although I read something Christian Brinkoff. I believe they're actually coming out with something right now, like as we speak, within the next few days. They said they're going to add support for Azure AD. So that'll be very beneficial because that'll be the key to setting up the single sign-on and allowing me to not have to have that second authentication dialog pop up and confuse users. But here's their desktop. So if they were on any machine, as long as they're in this browser, they can make this go full screen. They can unpin that. And you're basically looking at my desktop. Now, I've noticed I've got some bars here, and I've been reading up on that, and it seems like NVIDIA drivers have an issue right now. They're putting these white borders around Windows, which is really weird, but that's nothing to do with what we're doing here. So that is the browser-based version, or how they can connect through the browser. We saw on the iPad they've got that app. You can also use the app on a Windows machine. I'm going to do something I never do. We know better as instructors, we've learned. But we're going to try this first time, hasn't been tested yet. I am going to click. So basically, I just downloaded this app from the store. I'm going to click subscribe. And then I'm going to log in. And sure, I could choose this app only, and that's really not what we are here to see. So give it a second. So it's basically doing the same thing, reaching out to Azure, verifying my identity, and then figuring out what rights I have or what feeds I should see. And hopefully what it will do is, again, show me something that looks very similar to what we just saw in the web interface. I want to show you this one mainly because it's got one cool feature that the web interface doesn't, and that's the resizing capabilities. Hopefully it'll work. We'll see what happens here. But when you resize this app, the entire desktop scales. So it's not like you have scroll bars and you have to scroll. I always hate scroll bars on my desktop, especially horizontals. And this, there we go. We shall see. One of the cool features of this app is that ability. So as you can see, there's my feed. I'll double click on that. Should reach out and attempt to authenticate me. So this is more like the old MSTSC client, right? The old Microsoft Remote Desktop client. And the idea is, and of course it didn't actually do it, is that it would scale and not give me those bars. And this is why we don't do demos live, untested in front of an audience. But there we go. So not working currently. It could be because I'm not going to guess. I don't know why it's not doing it. Huh, interesting. All right, well, that feature is not one we'll use as a selling point for Windows Virtual Desktop. But just another way that you can see that they can connect to, I'm going to log out of this session, to Windows Virtual Desktop. So really 3 different ways. They can use the app, they can use the portal or the web interface, or an app on another device there. All right, so that is an example of Windows Virtual Desktop in action. Any questions so far? Yes.
Can you use a YubiKey or something similar so people don't have to have a password?
Not yet. Hopefully they will add that support, but nothing as of yet. They do support multi-factor authentication if it's enforced through Azure, but I haven't seen any support yet for tokens or anything like that, hardware-based tokens or anything.
What protocol is being used?
It uses WinRM, and I was trying to think of what the other one is. And it's doing a secure, RDP, remote desktop protocol. But it's not using your standard ports, and I can't remember what it ends up opening up on Azure. But this virtual machine, for example, the VM that I'm using does not have internet, I should say it doesn't have internet access. You're not connecting through port 3389 to that VM. It's going in a roundabout way through your network security groups and being routed through Azure to that instance of that VM that it's setting up. So that VM is not exposed directly to the internet, and so you're not going to have a chance, or people aren't going to have a chance to try to break into it, if that makes sense.
So, is this offered in like a server product that's available so you can just do it all locally?
No, not yet. It's part of your Azure subscription. So it was
In Azure.
it's only in Azure.
So
Yep.
you can't
And that's the idea, right? Is
desktop services in like Windows Server 19 or
correct. It's not. There's no way to set this up and run it in-house at this point, because of all the infrastructure, the IaaS that they need to run this is all hosted up in there in the data center. Now, we actually had a question in our webinar about this, and I meant to look that up. I don't know if you're running like Azure Stack, a big old rack of machines or something, whether you can. I don't think you can at this point. I think it's only in Azure.
One of the big challenges was the remote FX stuff. The graphics acceleration that it does is all built around one particular model of graphics card, which Microsoft has a ton of.
Mm-hmm.
So then, if you build it out yourself, you don't have that same hardware, and so now you get the latency and stuff that people hate.
Okay. Yeah, and the video, the performance is fantastic. I was at Ignite and watching a couple sessions, and a couple of the project managers were putting on, and they were streaming videos from that remote desktop session. And if you guys have ever tried to do that in a VDI type environment, it's very, your frame rate takes a dive and it gets very blocky. But it was very, very good.
No, if you run 10 gig,
Yeah.
I can say you can stream video from a remote machine.
Right.
10 gig connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Don, we can buy one of those, right? We got the resources for that.
We should buy 2 in case one breaks.
Yeah.
So if a company was looking to upgrade or invest in something like that, what would they be looking at?
Really, it's your Azure subscription. And another great thing about you're going to pay for the cost of running the VM. But one of the cool things that Microsoft has done with this VDI or this Windows Virtual Desktop is they're only billing you for the compute cycles that are actually being used. So when I connected to that VM up there, that virtual machine had to spin up, and it's now using compute and memory, and it's costing me. I used a very small virtual machine that's running about 4 cents an hour or something like that. And it's billed on I want to say it's per minute. They break it down pretty small. But as soon as that user disconnects and that VM's not doing anything anymore, the billing stops.
So it's when it disconnects, it stops billing?
Yep.
That's
fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, compared to having to shut it down.
Yeah. Yep. A user forgets to shut it down, or you've got to write scripts or set up. Now in the VMs, you can set up where it's like automatically shuts down at 9 o'clock at night if nobody's using it, but there's still an hour or more that you're just, waiting for the script to kick in. So the fact that they only bill you while it's being used, and even during the day, you might have, 10 people, 20 people connect, and then 10 drop off, and you're not getting billed for all of those people. And it spins up instances, depending on how you set up the VM, we can do what's called pooled, or you can do individual. So if it's pooled, which is what I've got set up, that means that, and I've told it what my usage is expected, like light or heavy as far as the user, and how many users I want per VM. And I set mine, I think, 10. And so what will happen is it spins up that VM when Aubrey connected. Now, if Wes goes to connect in, it'll just use that same VM because the VM is multi-session Windows 10 edition, as long as performance is still acceptable. And then after so many people connect to it, like I said, I set mine to 10, or if the performance starts degrading, it'll just spin up another instance, and new people that are connecting will connect to that. And it'll keep doing that as needed, and as people drop off, it can take one of those instances down and move everybody back into that one. So it does a really good job of handling that, which helps you control your costs. Because now you're not saying, all right, I got 50 users, I need 50 VMs. You might be able to get away with 5 VMs and put 10 users on each. But your engineers might be a little heavier, so maybe they can only do 1 or 2 users per VM. And if you need it, you can also do individuals to where when Wes logs in, he connects to a session that nobody shares with, he gets full VM, and you can do it that way as well. The image I'm using actually has Office installed on it already, which is really nice because I didn't have to do anything. I went in there and said, all right, I need a new VM. I want to use Windows 10 multi-session 1903, I think is the current one they've got up there. And I want Office installed on it. And it built the VM for me and everything's good to go. Now when Aubrey logs in, I have a Microsoft 365 license assigned to her account. So that gives her the license to use Windows 10, and it also has the Office licenses in there as well. So she can use all of those products without me having to install anything. It's really nice. Let's see what else. Do you guys want to see the actual, yes?
I mean, how does licensing work? Because I mean, basically, you know, you're providing a copy of Windows that theoretically, 20 different individual users can use.
Each one of those users will need a license assigned to them. When you go to, like if I come out here to...
it's like terminal services or...
Yep. So I'm going to go into like portal.
So you actually determine how many simultaneous users you can have by purchase.
Yep, exactly right. So when I come in here...
So it's just like terminal services.
Yep. Because each user has to have, they have to have a Windows 10 license. There's a few different subscription levels that you can use. But gosh, I was working with a gentleman from a company and they had, I forget what they had. Like an action pack or something licensed through Microsoft, and that was not enough. It did not cover what they were doing with Windows Virtual Desktop, and he was having issues connecting, and I was trying to explain to him, I said, there's only 4 or 5 license types that Windows Virtual Desktop will accept, and that's not one of them. So here's my Microsoft 365 E5 licenses, and I've come in, and it's a little slow. You can see where these are the users that I've assigned that license to. So because Aubrey has this license assigned to her account, that's what allows her to connect to that Windows 10 machine. So the machine itself isn't licensed, you're licensing the users, basically, if that makes sense.
Well, you're using per seat license.
Yes, yep.
Not per server.
Yep. And the nice thing is it covers, like with that Office 360, with that Microsoft 365 license, that covers my needs for the operating system, for Office. It gives me access to things like Azure Information Protection. So just depending on what license. In fact, if we looked at, let's see. God, I can't type. Let's take a peek. I'll give you that list. Actually, let me see if I can find it here. Somewhere in here, they've given me a list, and I don't know where it is now. There we go. So you can see Microsoft 365, E3, E5, student license, F1, which is a new one. I'm not real familiar with that one. But you can do Windows 10 Enterprise, E5, Windows 10 Education, and then whatever the VDA is. So those are the only ones that would work. So if you have like an Office 365 license, that's not going to cover it. Yep.
What about other
Those you would have to still license, like if I wanted to install some kind of CAD software on there for my engineers or some other productivity, Adobe or something like that, I'd still need to handle licensing outside. Make sure I had enough to cover however many users were going to be connecting to that. And you can like I said, you can upload, or you can use Microsoft's images, which is what I did here, just a stock Windows 10 with Office installed, multi-user, or you can upload your own custom images with your own software. I've done just for experiments, like I installed Notepad++ on an image, uploaded it, and was able to set this up so that my users could connect to it.
Can packages be installed?
I think, but I'm not positive. Like you can basically build the VM locally if you wanted to, and then upload that drive, and then use that as create your template and use that. Now the one downside currently, well, I say the one downside, caveat is a lot of this is still done through PowerShell. The initial setup, a lot of the configuration is done from command line. The GUI is, they've said back in September at Ignite that they were working on the administration page for Portal at Azure. Still haven't seen it yet. Seen lots of screenshots of the people using it, in the higher up of Microsoft, but no access to it yet. So a lot of this is done through the portal, through PowerShell. Monitoring it is still challenging as well because of that very fact. There's just not a lot of support for it in the GUI or in Portal.Azure currently. But that'll come because Microsoft wants to make this easy for people to use. This is, no crystal ball, but I think virtual desktop is probably where a lot of this is headed. It's just so much easier than trying to keep physical machines up to date, issuing machines out to users. Everybody's got their own tech. They can buy their own laptop and I can give them access to that virtual desktop that has just my company software on it and keep it isolated from everything else.
I kind of see it as something that would be like voice over IP. You just plug it in, you can plug it in wherever and you've got your service.
Yep, exactly. It's so, once it's set up, well, you saw me connect with the iPad, which I should probably shut off now. And any, technically, well, not technically, I could go to any machine, right? I could be at my neighbor's house, I could be at a customer's site, and I can say, hey, can I borrow your computer for a second? Open up a browser and log into my Windows 10 desktop, right? And have access to all my software or whatever it was that's part of my virtual desktop. And the other cool thing about this is that it's not just the desktop. You can also publish just applications. Like let's say I don't want to give them the entire Windows 10 desktop. I don't want to license a Windows 10 desktop, but my users need access to Microsoft Office Word or PowerPoint or something like that. I can create what's called remote app groups that publish just those applications. So like terminal services, but I don't have to run some monitor, install the application, run some monitor, have it watching all the bits and try to create some kind of package to deploy. They just simply go to that page and instead of seeing that one icon, they'd see, in fact, we can set it up, we'll switch it over here in a minute, to where they see just the applications that I've chosen to make available for them.
Mike, that seems like a culmination of what we used to have to set up on-prem with AppV.
Yep, exactly.
It's just kind of like they push that up to the cloud.
Yep, it kind of all of that stuff, terminal services, AppV, user, UV, is all coming together to make this solution.
Interesting.
Yep. So yeah, you can publish out the applications. The other big thing is profiles. I think I mentioned that at the very beginning, is how do you handle that? Like if this isn't persistent, if we're allowing the VMs to shut down and bring up on demand, if I put something in my documents, my users expect that to be, if they put something in their documents, they expect that to be there the next time they log in. So Microsoft has worked with a company called FSLogix, and they have created this way to use a file share basically as a storage spot for a virtual hard drive. And that virtual hard drive contains your profile. So what's going to happen is every time you go to connect to Windows Virtual Desktop, it's going to recognize the fact that we're using profile containers, and it's going to look to that file share based on your user ID, and it's going to see that there is a profile up there, or basically a VHD, right, a virtual hard drive, that it's going to then mount up, and Windows 10 sees it as a local drive, as a local profile. It doesn't know any better that it's not. So we're just mounting up a VHD on the fly that contains their profile. So it's very fast. It's not like roaming profiles where you've got to log on and wait for that profile to copy down to the machine or anything like that. It's just a VHD that gets mounted up and it's instantly accessible. And it supports things like OneDrive. One of the big things they worked with was things like OneDrive and Office for being able to be, again, persistent, used on a non-persistent environment, and being able to, because you know how it is. Every time you go to a new machine, you log on, OneDrive spins up, and it wants you to log in and set up and all this stuff. Well, because your profile, as soon as you save something, do something, it's going to that VHD. When you log off, the VHD just gets, is just disconnected or dismounted, and it's ready to go the next time you log in.
So Mike, you said AIP or Azure Information Protection can be incorporated to this too, right? So if I have personally identifiable information that we can, through whatever you tack on there, we can tack that on.
Yep, absolutely. Still use all of your normal, stuff to keep your data safeguarded. Yep. And it's I don't know, I geek out on this stuff, but it's really pretty neat the way they got that working with those virtual hard drives. In fact, they're actually working on something called, I'm going to slaughter the name of this, MSIX. One of the things that I think we're going to see coming down the pipe is something very similar to what they're doing with profiles with applications. So right now, the profile is separate from the virtual machine. And when you log on to the virtual machine, it's just mounting that VHD that contains your profile. And when you look in the file server, you'll see a VHD for each user. So each user has their own little VHD that gets mounted up when they log in. They're working on something with applications the very same way. They're going to set it up to where you install an application in a separate VHD. And if you want that VHD to be used on that VM, it can just mount that VHD. Or that app, sorry, if you want that application to be available on that VM, it can just plug that VHD in and use the application. You don't have to, it's going to get to the point where I don't have to create that master image and install all the software that my users are going to use, right? I'm going to have, AutoCAD on a VHD. And when an engineer logs in, it'll be smart enough to know, okay, they're going to need these programs, so let's mount up these VHDs. But somebody else logs in, it can mount up a different set of VHDs to give them the applications that they would require to do their job. So it's pretty clever what they've done. Yes?
If you have multiple VMs, is there a VPN so they can network with each other?
They are connected like when I set up the VM, the template, because when you go in and you create what's called a host pool, and that creates that initial VM, and that does need to be added. It has to be on the same subnet. It has to be able to connect to Active Directory, for example, and it does have internet access. Now, so as long as your Azure network is set up properly, the VMs will have internet access. In fact, the way I'm setting it up right now, I've got a hybrid scenario. My domain controller is here in our server closet, and I've got a VPN, a site-to-site VPN that goes back out to Azure. So when I connect to that, it has to reach across that VPN and authenticate me with Active Directory here before it allows me to access. Mm-hmm.
Do you have HyperV services in that?
I have HyperV running on my laptop.
I'm talking about in the remote desktop.
I don't think so. You start getting into that whole inception thing where you got the VM inside the VM inside the VM. I haven't tried it, to be honest with you.
Like VMware Workstation.
Yeah, and you can do that with Hyper-V, but I've never tried it in one of their VMs up in Azure to see if it'll let me install.
Most of the time, they won't let you. I know if you put Windows Workstation on a machine that's got Hyper-V, at least my experience is it won't run.
Right.
It says, I think like virtualization in the processor's already been claimed.
Yeah, yep.
Something like that.
With Windows, I have successfully run a VM inside a VM on my Windows 10 machine. In fact, but there's a configuration, there's a registry entry that you have to change that allows that nested virtualization. Because we did a show once where I needed to show them Hyper-V. I needed to show them how to install Hyper-V and how to create virtual machines, and I couldn't do that on my host machine because it was running the stuff I needed for the show. So it is possible to do nested, but I don't know if you can do that with one of the VMs up there. I don't know if they give you access to everything you would need to turn that on. because the processor that the VM was using would need to support.
Well, I remember when I had a virtual machine in Azure, they wouldn't let you use,
Yeah.
HyperV services. They said-
Which kind of makes sense. I mean, they just want you to spin up another VM, right? I guess they're trying to say, you know.
And then when I tried to install, VMware Workstation.
Mm-hmm.
it-
Yeah.
I mean, it installed when you started it.
Yep.
It just said no, virtualization services available.
Yeah, they kind of clash,
Whatever,
don't they?
'cause I like to run a Mac OS as a virtual machine.
Right.
You know.
Yep. Yeah, that's something I haven't tried. I'll have to give that a whirl one day when I've got nothing better to do. See if I can do some VM inside a VM inside a VM.
Most of the time you can't do it because it's like the virtualization chip in the chip,
Mm-hmm.
those registers have already been claimed.
Right. So it just says nope.
So it's like your processor no longer
Supports the.
supports
yeah,
virtualization.
yeah.
It's already being used.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that it's whether or not the virtualization virtualizes like the Intel V or the AMD. Yeah.
That's exactly whoever gets it first.
Yep. All right, so that is probably a pretty good look at what Windows Virtual Desktop is all about. And you've seen it in action, so you want to see how we set it all up? Is that something you guys are interested in? Yep, all right. So let's take a look. There's a lot of steps to it, and there's a few caveats or gotchas that I'll point out to you as we go. One of the first things that you have to do is you have to give permission to the Virtual Desktop Service to read your Azure Active Directory and access into your user account. So they've got a web page that you go to. And this is all, when you look at the documentation for Windows Virtual Desktop, they've got step-by-steps that walk you through this. But this is the Windows Virtual Desktop consent page. And basically, as you can see what it's telling, they're giving it consent to the back-end web app, to the tenant that we're going to be creating. And you have to do it twice, once for the server app and once for the client app. Those are different components of the Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. So what you would do is I would choose server app, and then I can either type in my AAD, my Azure Active Directory tenant GUID, or I can just use the name, which is easy enough. All right. And I'll click submit, and it's going to pop up this dialog box. Well, it's going to make me authenticate. And then here's what it's going to ask for. These are the permissions that the Windows Virtual Desktop application needs. So read, but you can see it's all read. It's not making any changes to your directory. And then you simply click accept. Now I've already done that, but it won't hurt to give it consent again. And then what they want you to do is wait. I want to say it says like at least 30 seconds or a few minutes. I think it says on here, yeah. Allow 30-second delay. Basically, they want to make sure that Azure acknowledges the fact that you just consented for the server app before you consent for the client app. And I've seen that give people issues. They try to do this a little too fast. So give it a few minutes. Walk away, grab a cup of coffee, a soda or something, come back, and then just do the exact same thing for the client app. The client app doesn't need as many. So you can see it needs access to the Windows Virtual Desktop Service and to sign in and read the user profile. So again, you're just going to accept that. All right. So that's giving consent for the service to reach into your infrastructure and access that information. The next thing you'd want to do is create what's called a tenant creator role. So when you set up Windows Virtual Desktop, you first create what's known as a tenant. So we're inside our subscription, and my subscription is called IT Pro TV Demo. In there, we're going to create a tenant. A tenant is the overall container for the Windows Virtual Desktop. Right? Within the tenant, we create host pools. And host pools, so the tenant's like the container or the outer folder. The host pool is what you're going to make available. So that host pool might be a Windows 10 multi-user, or it could be your custom image with your software installed on it. So you can create as many host pools, and you can actually create separate tenants if you need that separation. But you create the host pool within there, and you need somebody that has this tenant creator role. And they don't make this easy to find. We're going to look for enterprise applications. So I just did a quick search up there for enterprise applications, and I launched that. And as I scroll through this list, okay, somewhere down here, I'm going to see the Windows Virtual Desktop, not the Windows Virtual Desktop Client. Those are the two things that we just gave consent to. What you want is the Windows Virtual Desktop. We're going to click on that. I'll zoom back out here. So now I'm at this Windows Virtual Desktop Enterprise application, and I'm going to go down to Users and Groups. And here I can see there's 2 users. When you first come in here, your account most likely will be listed here with default access. Even though I'm a global admin in this tenant or in this subscription, it's not enough. You have to have the tenant creator role. So don't think, oh, I saw myself there, I'm good to go, and try to move on. You need to click Add User, find the user that you want to give these permissions to, and click Select. Now you don't have any other choices. The only role you can assign is tenant creator. I can't click there and do anything. I just click Assign, and now you'll see the Cherokee's account has that tenant creator permission. So that's the first thing you're going to do. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to go and get 2 pieces of information. You need your Azure Active Directory tenant ID, or what's known as your directory ID, and you also are going to need your Azure subscription ID. And we are recording all of this for future, so I don't know if I should show some of those numbers. I don't think they'll be, it's our trial account, right? We'll see them. I know, right? I don't think I can get in too much trouble sharing those numbers. You're going to need a little more than that. But let me show you where you'd find them. I'm going to jump back out to my dashboard, and I'm going to navigate over to my Azure Active Directory. And there I can see my tenant ID, and it gives me a nice handy-dandy little copy button. So I can copy that out. And typically what I'll do is I'll just go into a notepad and paste that in there. That was my directory ID. All right. And then for your subscription ID, I find the easiest way to do that is just to go to Subscriptions. And you'll see it right there, but a little hint, if you click in here, you've got the actual copy button. So we'll come out there and we'll paste that down there, and that was my sub ID. So those 2 pieces of information you would need before you start this whole process. Otherwise, you'll be scrambling around trying to find those. All right, so once we've got that done, we're going to go and we're going to create the actual Windows Virtual Desktop tenant. You will use PowerShell, and I'm just going to minimize that to kind of clean things up here. And you need, let me see if I've got these going yet. I do not. So I am going to import dash module. There's 2 modules I'll end up using. One is the RD, what is that module called? I gotta remember that. Microsoft.RD Infra. There we go. So this module you can download from Microsoft for free. Import, you can do install dash module, which will reach out and grab it. And then import module will make it available in this session. So now I can see that I have that. These are all of the PowerShell commands you need to work with remote desktop services in the Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. You also need the Azure AD module. So import dash module, Azure AD. And now I should have both of those modules available in my session. So there's Azure AD and my RD infrastructure. All right, so we got those 2 guys installed. The next thing we'll do is we'll connect out to our Azure subscription. And for that, I'm going to try to see if I can search here. Yep, there we go. So it's add-RDS account -deployment URL, and then this RD web, RD broker WVD, if I can say that, .microsoft.com. Again, available in the documentation. And it does this to me every time. It like pops up behind my screen there. So this is my authentication. This is where you're going to want to use that whatever user you assign that tenant creator role to. All right, so now I'm authenticated. And now I can start running those commands like get-rds tenant. As I said, I've already spun one up so that we would have something to look at here. But just running this command verifies that I've got that module available and everything, and I'm authenticated as a tenant creator, and I'll be able to get in here. And there's the tenant that I've already created. Now to create that tenant, it was simply new dash RDS tenant, and then dash name, and then this is where you would put in AITP demo, right? And then my AAD tenant ID, which would be this guy. All right. And then I would also need my Azure subscription ID, which should be this one. And then fingers crossed, all goes well, we have our new tenant. So basically I've just created that container that I can then create those host pools within, all right? Now to create a host pool, actually, let me go back one more here, we've already done that. I am gonna bump ahead just a wee bit because I know we're getting a little short on time. You would end up creating what's called a service principal or a service account. And I'll skip those because I've already created one. In fact, I can show you get-azure application, maybe. Oh, I haven't connected, sorry. Let's do connect-azure AD. Let me authenticate real quick for that. I knew I mistyped that one. I'd end up creating a service account. You need an account that all of this is going to run under. Right, so basically you walk through the steps of creating a service principal and then capturing that information. When you create it, trying to think of a good way to say this, you'll create this service principal. It basically gives it an application ID and it generates a password for you. And you will need to capture that information. One other big caveat while you're going through this is once you start creating that service principal, don't close this window, because if you close your PowerShell session, you will not be able to get the password that it generated for that service account. So what I would recommend you do is create your service principal, and in the documentation on Microsoft, it shows you how to create it and how to retrieve that information. And they say, you know, grab it now. I pipe it out into a text file. That way I've always got that information, because if you, like I said, once you close it, you shouldn't need it again. According to Microsoft, I will tell you, I've needed it again, and I needed that password. And if I hadn't exported it out into a text file, I'd be in trouble. I would not have access to it. So second caveat, when you create your Surface account to set all this up, record the password for that, keep it in a secure place, because you might need it again, and there's no way to retrieve it from Azure. So the service principal gets created, and I don't need that guy again until later on. We'll end up assigning him to the RDS owner role using PowerShell as well. But I think what I'd like to do, because I know we're getting a little short on time, a lot of this is just the technicals of how to get it going. What I really want to show you, what I think you'd be interested in, is more about how do I publish that desktop and how do I publish individual applications. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to do a get-rds tenant, right? And I should see now that I have two. I've got the one I created earlier and the one we just created now, AITP demo, and the one I created earlier, AITP test. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say $T equals AITP test, because this is going to make my life a whole lot easier. And it would help if I put some quotes around that and told it was a string there. There we go. So $T is now going to include my tenant name, so I can use that in my PowerShell commands. Now within this tenant, we're going to create what's called a host pool. So that's new-rds host pool. You got to tell it what your tenant name is. You have to forgive me, I skip the parameters all the time, but when I'm doing demos, I really should show you what I'm using here. So let's do a $T, right? So new RDS host pool, and I could create something called, maybe we call this one, I don't know, AITP demo pool, something like that. Sorry, I missed it. Oh, pool one, yeah. All right, so there I have a new host pool within my tenant. All right, let's see what else we want to do. So now I'm going to flip back over, I think, and use the, I have the other host pool that I've created. You can do a get-rds host pool, and within my tenant, that $T, I should see that I have two host pools now. The one we just created, AITP demo host pool, and this test host pool that I created earlier. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing. The tenant is like the overall container. The host pool is the one we end up creating the VM inside. All right. Once we've created the host pool, we then flip over to the portal, and this part gets done through the portal. This is the part that can take a little while. You would do Windows Virtual Desktop. And you what you call provisioning a host pool. So you click Create, and you give it your information, your subscription, your resource group that you want to create this in, what region you want to set it up in, the host pool name, and this is where I can choose pooled or personal. In fact, let's go ahead and fill out some of this so you can see these options. So let's do that. I'm just going to pick values that are good for my subscription. East US, I'm going to call this, we'll call it Pool 01. All right. And then pooled versus personal. This is what I was talking about, whether it's a shared desktop or an individual's desktop. Default desktop users, this is where I can add the UPN of the users that I want to allow, and I can do a comma-separated list. You can also do this after the fact with PowerShell. I find it actually easier to do it after the fact with PowerShell, but you can do it here as well. And then you'd click Next. This is where you can set the usage profile. Like these are going to be office workers, light usage, or these are my developers, heavy usage. How many users do you want per VM before they start spinning up new ones? And then the virtual machine size, right? Because this is going to affect your cost in the end. What VM do you want to use? Depending on for my demos, I use a really small one, 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of memory. But obviously, if you wanted your users to have good performance, you might want to bump that up a little bit. And then the VM name prefix. All the VMs, as they spin up, it'll add a -0, -1, -2 to it. So this is just a prefix for it. Setting-wise, this is where I can choose, question? Sorry? Nope, okay. This is where I can choose where I'm getting the image from. Remember I said you could create your own custom image. So if I had a managed image that I wanted to pull from, a VHD that I had uploaded, blob storage, maybe I had stored a VM there, or from Microsoft's gallery, which is those pre-built ones, which you can see Windows 10 Enterprise, multi-session with Office 365 ProPlus. I mean, that's the winner right there, right? I don't have to install anything. And this is the only place, I know Microsoft loves this when you push this, it's the only place you can get the Windows 10 multi-session edition. All right. Disk types, that's just going to affect your performance as well as your cost. And then here, this machine will be part of the domain, right? It does have to join the domain, so it does need connectivity to your domain controller. As I said, either hybrid, like I've got with the site-to-site VPN back to my domain controller here, or I'm running Azure AD domain services out in Azure. But not just Azure AD, right? It's got to be the Azure AD domain services. As of now. Now tomorrow they're going to add support for Azure AD, and you can say, Mike didn't know what he's talking about. All right? But you'd put in your domain join UPN, so this might be the account that I'm going to use that has rights. Like I actually have another account that's not a domain admin called DJ. And I've went into Active Directory and I've delegated the right to join machines to the domain. So that account doesn't have any other rights other than the ability to join to the domain. Type in your password, whatever you want to use. This is one place I found it a little annoying because they want you to use a 12-character password. Which meant resetting some of the passwords on my administrative accounts because they were strong, but they weren't 12 characters long, and it really bothered me. But that's just me. All right, let me get out of the Zoom here. So you'd enter in your, let me just go ahead and, Now I won't be able to match that. There we go. Then you could, if you want that machine to pop into a specific OU within your domain, right? So that you can have your group policies being applied to this, because this is, in the end, this VM that gets spun up is a domain member. So I can manage it using group policy. I can manage it using my Intune policies, just like I manage all of my other machines. It does need to be set up on a virtual network that has access to your domain controller. So that I had to set up all ahead of time, right? I had to create my site-to-site VPN, had to set up my VPN endpoint on this end, had to configure my subnets, my virtual networks, my network security groups, and all that before I ever did this. So that all has to be configured ahead of time, all right? And then the last screen is here. Tenant groups, you can actually, if you're a provider, you might have more than one tenant you're managing. You can set up tenant groups. They always recommend just leave the default tenant group unless you need to change that for some reason. The virtual desktop tenant name, that's our AITP test that we set up. And then the Windows Virtual Desktop Tenant RDS owner. This is where you're going to use that service principal that I didn't show you how to create, but that you would create. Because you really don't want to use like a domain admin or anything like that. Obviously that would work, but probably way too many rights, right, for doing what we're doing here. And if it was ever to get compromised, that would be a bad day. So you change that to service principal, and this is where you need the information. I said don't close your PowerShell window. This is where you're going to paste that information in. So the application ID is basically the username of that service principal, and then the password twice, and then you paste that tenant ID in there again. And once you've done all that, you click Review and Create. It'll give you a green check mark, assuming you've passed, and then it begins the process of spinning up that virtual machine. Once that VM, and then it goes through several steps. And if it's successful, again, the key here is to make sure that you've got everything set up, that the account you're using has the rights to join the machine to the domain, and you have connectivity to the domain controller. And you've got licenses installed for Microsoft for Windows. Because I will tell you that I sat here and banged my head on this keyboard several times for several days in a row because I kept getting red check marks. I could not get this to pass. I couldn't get past this step. Because when you click Next, it's going to validate all your choices. Now, obviously, I didn't fill out all the boxes, so it's going to fail. But when I was doing this for myself, I filled out all the boxes, and it was still failing, and I couldn't get it. And the error was generic. It didn't tell you anything that had to do with the problem. And it turned out one time was a licensing issue, and then another time it turns out that the VPN connection back to my Active Directory had dropped, and so unbeknownst to me, it wasn't able to reach out and talk to the domain controller. So do pay attention to that. But once you get green check marks here, you'd click Create, and this is the step that probably takes a good 45 minutes to deploy that VM. Once it's deployed, that's it. You've already assigned a user if you did it during that phase with that dialog box, or you can go back into PowerShell and you can add additional users. Now we've created that, I have Aubrey has access. We saw her get access to the full-blown desktop. And that is because get-rds group from my tenant. I don't know if I'm using the right tenant now. Tenant name. Let's do test. That first one I made it. And then host pool name was test host pool, because I'm very creative. All right. So this gets created by default. This is the default or the desktop application group. And this gives you access to the entire desktop and any applications that are installed on that desktop. What I did after the fact is I went back and created an additional app group called Office Basic. Right? And then what I want to do is I want to publish apps. So this is similar to the old terminal services days, right? We got to publish these applications and make them available. So what you would do is you would do a get-rds start menu app, right? And then my $T, actually I'm going to do, $T. I can't remember if $T was which host pool that was. And then test host pool. pool. Let's see if that gives me at, and then basic. All right. So what that command does is basically list every application that's installed on that VM. And what you're looking for is the friendly name or the app alias. And you end up adding applications to the app group. So you do a command like this. Once you rifled through here and you found, okay, Word is installed, and the app alias and the friendly name are Word. All right, well, that's convenient. I've actually already added Word, so maybe let's do WordPad. So what I'd end up doing is, and I got to remember this command, new-RDS remote app, all right? And you would tell it the tenant name, the host pool name, the app group name. So right, there's my tenant. Within that tenant, I have a host pool named test host pool. Within that host pool, I have an app group named Office Basic, and I want to add the application named WordPad. And the app alias, I should do the app alias, right? Yeah. Dash app alias is also WordPad. Yeah, I should be using quotes around those guys for strings, but I'm lazy. Right? And so what that does is it now publishes WordPad as part of this particular app group. So if I wanted to see that, I could do get-rds, what is that going to be? App? Oh, actually RDS remote app, sorry. All these commands flip around the word app and remote, and it changes the command completely. Remote app for my tenant, my host pool, and my app group. And let's make that even easier to read. Let's just get the friendly name. So within this particular app group, these are the apps I've made available. And notice we just added WordPad. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add Aubrey. I'm going to give her access to this particular app group. Here's what you got to remember. By default, when I first set this up, we had that default desktop application group, which includes every application on that desktop. Aubrey has access to that. So if I try to add her to this app group I just created, it's going to say, why? She already has access to every app through the entire desktop. So this is another one of those gotchas that they don't document really well. When you start creating these app groups and you want to give somebody access to just particular apps, you've got to pull them out of that default app group first. Take away the entire desktop, and then you can turn around and give them access to just those particular applications. Now, if we had a separate host pool, we could give her access to that entire desktop and then only applications within this host pool. Does that make sense? Because they are separate, so you can set it up that way if you want to. So I'm going to do remove. Oh gosh, I've got to remember this command because I don't think I actually wrote this down. So let's do remove RDS app group user from, tell it where you're pulling it from, right? $T test host pool off, and then it's actually the desktop application group, and then the user principal name, Aubrey at itprotvdemo.com. Right. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling her out of that desktop application group, and now I'm simply going to add her. And yeah, I'm lazy, so I'm going to reuse this command. So now we're going to do an add RDS app group user to Office Basic. And I've already got our UPN in there, so I'll hit enter. And if I get -RDS app group user from $T test host pool Office Basic. There I can see Aubrey. Now, it's it only lists one user because I just added that one user, but this would show you all the users that are part of that particular application group. So now if we go back over to our here, now it's disconnected me, so I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to refresh this page, and let's see how quick this happens. Ta-da. So no longer do I have access to the entire desktop, but I have access to the individual applications. So if I want to launch Word, still have to authenticate. And I'll show you, this is kind of neat. Let's see if I can do this real quick, if it'll let me. Oh, it's not letting me. If I can click on it quick enough, you'll see the entire desktop spins up, but then it goes away and it just gives her access to the application. It's just kind of funny. FSLogix, this is the profile that I was talking about. I didn't show you that either. You guys don't have anywhere to go, do you? I can talk all night.
Do ordinary users not have to know about any of the stuff you did before what you're doing right now?
Exactly. Yep. Once it gets set up, all they do is go to that URL and authenticate. And whatever you've made available is all they get. And so here you can see full-blown version of Word. I can create my document. And she has a, and it's very responsive, as you saw. I mean, as soon as I switched her over to the other group, it removed her access from that desktop and gave her access to just these applications.
Does she have access to like a regular directory to be able to organize files?
Yes, as far as like, well, not through this. So here's the way this is going to work. So without the entire desktop, like she doesn't have File Explorer, but when she does the file save, she is going to have access to her OneDrive account. And notice I've got her documents. Because I've got that profile mounted up on that VHD, she can save these into her documents and go from there. So she would have access to these. You can see other documents that I played around with in other demos are still there. And that was a while ago, right? That's just sitting there in that profile. I know we're short on time because I could spend a lot of time talking about setting that up. So to create that profile, I had to create a separate virtual machine. Microsoft will allow you to do it a couple of different ways with the profiles. They recommend the FSLogix. That's the one they want you to use. It's no cost, which is really cool. You spin up a second VM, and within that VM, you basically create a file share. That's all it is. And you set permissions just like you would if you've ever set up roaming profiles or folder redirects, where you set up your permissions so that the users have create permission at the root folder and then full control over anything they created. You basically set it up like that. And then they get full control over the VHD. The only thing they'll tell you is disable antivirus scanning of the VHDs because your Windows VM is going to scan it for viruses anyway, so you don't want the machine that's hosting the share scanning the actual VHD files. That will kill performance. Yeah, I was trying to think of something, a way I could show you, but I don't know if I still have that remote desktop connection downloaded. And I don't see it here. But like I said, I created a VM, and then I on the image for the actual Windows Virtual Desktop, I installed the FSLogix software. And that creates a couple of registry entries that lets it know that you've enabled this. So when Aubrey logs in, because of those registry entries, it knows the path. Basically, the registry entry is there's one registry entry to enable FSLogix profiles. And then there's another registry entry that will give it the path to where to look for those VHDs. So technically, you could set up different shares for different groups of users if you did different rights and things like that, just by controlling that policy. There's also a administrative template policy. I'm going to take the one thing I don't want to share. I'm leaving up there forever. There's a administrative template that you can download for a group policy. So you can import that into your group policy, and that'll allow you to create all of those settings from a central location. Another gotcha, here's one that killed me, that there is no documentation on, or very little. If FSLogix detects a profile on the machine already, a local profile, it will not kick in. It says, okay, you've got a profile, I'm done, and it stops. And so what was happening is I was setting all of this up, going through this test process, and I had already logged onto the machine to install the FSLogix software. So of course, the first time you log onto a machine, it creates your profile, right? So my profile is there. I went through all these steps, I'm going through it, I'm why isn't this working? It's not generating the VHD over here. I'm not seeing anything pop up in the share. It's just not working. And I went through it a dozen times trying to figure it out. Finally found a little documentation on FSLogix website that explained if you already had a local profile, it would respect that and not do anything differently. So there's a registry setting that you can turn on that says if you have a local profile, delete it and start using FSLogix. Be careful with that option. Because yes, it worked perfectly and it did delete the profile, which was okay because it was just my user account that I logged in to install the software. But if this was an actual user and they already had documents and stuff, that profile would have been gone and there's no way to recover it. So be careful with that option. It's good if you need it, but it will cause data loss if you're not careful. And that, my friends, I think will probably do it for Windows Virtual Desktop. If any questions or anything else you want to see or take a look at.
I don't want to sound negative,
Uh-huh.
but I'm coming from a security background.
Okay.
I'm trying to, look under the covers.
Yep.
Accidental or intentional denial of service, where are the weak spots in this? What could shut down a 10-person office on, say, 2 hosts?
Internet connectivity, right, is probably going to be the first one.
I'm going to put a checkbox by that because for most places, if your internet's down, you're dead to water.
Everything's down, exactly. Connectivity to your authentication servers will be the next biggest issue I think that people will or that would cause downtime, is if that site-to-site VPN went down, I might not notice it, right? And I've got users that are either here or remote, and they're trying to log in, and they're calling me up saying, hey, I can't get access. And the reason is because that Azure has to reach out across my VPN and authenticate that user in my on-premise directory. Hopefully with Azure AD support, that'll go away. Because once Azure AD authentication is supported, I won't need that connectivity back to my domain controller. In fact, I could potentially run it without Active Directory at all, right? Just Azure identities and my Azure VMs, which would mean then that eliminates that need to connect. The other way is if you were using Azure Active Directory domain services and for some reason that service was unavailable. Again, it would be an authentication issue there. Those are probably the biggest caveats. I mean, the rest of it, Azure provides fault tolerance, right? For just about everything we do, they give us the infrastructure as a service that's going to make sure those VMs are up and running. And if something happens, it'll move it to another rack or move it to another region. So depending on how you have your availability set up. So I think authentication is probably the biggest one. Because it's just a web client. So from your user's perspective, as long as they got a machine that'll run a browser and they've got internet access, they should be able to connect to it.
At this point, the answer is probably no, but in the future, would it be possible to craft malware that could, if one of your users went to a bad site, installed the malware, you can now reach over through whichever connection mechanism and grab the whole site and potentially the entire data center.
Possibly. There's always going to be that risk, I think. But with Azure security and the way they use the network security groups, and depending on what, again, your subscription includes, if you've got, they've got their threat protection, right? That's monitoring and looking for things like that. And because it's right there on their infrastructure, it should be able to detect and block anything almost instantly. So hopefully preventing that from spreading anywhere else. And then, so now it really comes back to another security weakness would be the authentication process. It does support multi-factor authentication though. So that's a good thing. So because if your users are using weak passwords, it doesn't really matter, right? But with multi-factor authentication, now my user, even if Joe Schmo finds her iPad and clicks on that thing and tries to authenticate and maybe even knows her password, if he doesn't have her phone to answer that, that MFA request, should keep it pretty safe.
So he'll just send her email telling her what to do and she'll do it for
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But all that would then, again, that's a separate configuration outside of Windows Virtual Desktop, right? Whether your Azure AD users require multi-factor authentication.
Since no one else has some questions, I'm continuing to work
Yeah, yeah.
black hat here. You've got a bunch of users, and one of your users is a bad actor. He spins up the machine, goes off, does bad thing, deletes it. Is there an audit trail?
There is, everything is logged. I don't know.
You have access to the audit trail. Microsoft may not have access to it, but do you have access to it?
I'm not positive. I'm pretty sure, but I'm not. It's not something I've looked into, so I don't want to guess. The nice thing is they're not going to be able to do too much, right? When they connect to that desktop, I didn't show you this, but they don't even have a shutdown option. Like they can disconnect from the session, but they can't shut it down. You could remote in as an admin, you could remote into the machine and power down or cycle it if you needed to. But they can just connect and disconnect. So they really can't do too much there. So I think they'd have a hard time. I'm not even sure, I guess they could connect via a browser and maybe download and try to install software, but that's something I haven't tried either, like how easy it would be for them to install software on that VM. Because I don't think it would persist, even if they did.
They've got a file of passwords or something that they shared, and once the machine boots off or is disconnected, even if they can delete it, is it gone or is it in the data center?
It's gone. The only thing that persists, the only thing that persists is your profile information that's in that VHD. So if you didn't put it in your documents or something like that, it would be gone. And in fact, you don't have to set that up either. If security was a big concern and you were not needing any persistence, if they stored all their documents in OneDrive, for example, or something like that, a cloud service, then you wouldn't even need to set up the profile thing, and they just get a new profile every time they come to the machine. So there wouldn't be any way for them to really save or store on that machine per se.
Shared it and say, hey, my session is wonky. Can you reboot it? Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah, that's true.
Evidence.
Yep. That'd be something I'd have to look into. I would assume, and again, this is me assuming, and you know what that spells, but if we set up monitoring, if we set up Azure logs, we can subscribe that VM to where the event logs and things like that would be sent over to monitor. We would need to set up a workspace, thank you, to collect all that information, and then it would be out of their reach. They wouldn't be able to get to it. We'd be able to query it, run reports against it, but they wouldn't be able to see it.
Have you seen, Mike, any kind of ROI studies as to the benefit to a business or organization adopting this?
A little bit. I can't quote you any of the numbers, but they in fact, when we go out to, the best place to look is going to be Microsoft, of course. I'll just real quick take a peek and see what they're. Let's see if I can find their. I was looking for not their documentation, but the sales pitch part. Let's see if I can find that real quick, because I want to say on here they had some of their customers that were utilizing this. Compliance-wise, obviously Azure supports some of that, and I was incorrect. I don't see that on there anymore. So no, I have not. I don't have any numbers I could quote you on that just yet.
Something I'd have to check out now.
Yeah, and you could look at things like the fact that it's not charging you except for when that machine's in use. I think would be a big key.
They probably would add it also to the pricing calculator if it's not there yet.
Oh yeah, it might be on the pricing calculator. That's a good point.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
So are the users able to implement BitLocker encryption?
You would do that on the VM. I don't think they can affect that.
So they can't choose to encrypt their files?
Correct. In fact, I say that. I don't even know for sure that I can do that. Now, the machine that's hosting the profiles, I think, is where I'd probably look at turning that on or trying to configure that. But I'd have to look into that. Don't quote me on that one just yet.
Does this more or less eliminate the need for backups?
No, I would.
Put it this way, I mean, the backups would be in the cloud. You wouldn't have to have.
Yes.
Or would you need to do?
No, you could, like that VM that's hosting the profiles, right? I could provide all of the fault tolerance I wanted with that. I could set up scale sets for that to provide performance. I'd want to probably set up a backup on that because that's all my users' profiles. But I would need to do that outside of Windows Virtual Desktop. I would need to look at that VM and back up those VHDs that way.
So that's a return on investment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's like a replication service or something you gotta pay for it, of course.
Yep.
It will all be replicated.
Yeah, and depending on, again, how you set it up with Azure, you can have this to where it's going across multiple regions. So if there was, give you the fault tolerance that way, or the disaster recovery abilities to move this out to another region that supported the Windows Virtual Desktops.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, that is going to wrap up our meeting for this evening. I do want to remind everybody that we've got Anthony, who is going to be here next month. The talk is actually, it's just labeled Cisco CCIE Anthony Sequeira. I did say it wrong that time, didn't I? Sequeira presents Cisco ACI. And he told me what ACI stood for, and I can't remember. It's application something. So, what's that?
I was thinking application controller interface.
Maybe, that might be it.
Sounds good.
But,
Application-centric infrastructure.
There you go.
thank you. Application-centric infrastructure. So that's coming up. It's going to focus a lot on programmability and automation and what's kind of replaced the old software-defined networking term that we used to hear a lot. SDN, it's so important. And now it's, in the Cisco world at least, becoming ACI. So we'll get to see that. That is going to be on March, I just had to pull it up, shoot. March 24th at 6 p.m. Just like tonight, we'll meet right back here in the classroom. It should be a good presentation. Mike, thanks again for coming and presenting to everybody. And for the rest of you, we look forward to seeing you next month. And if you're watching this on YouTube or recorded, be sure to check out our website at AITP-NCFL.org. You can always see the events that are upcoming, learn a little bit about the chapter. We also have the Gainesville Tech Meetup group on meetup.com, which is where we have been kind of scheduling some of these events and getting RSVPs from people. We're in both places, so either site, you can look us up and check us out. All right, everybody, have a great night, and we'll see you in March.